evening, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is McKaylee. I work at Tattered Cover Bookstore. And first and foremost, I want to say thank you. Thank you for supporting local independent businesses this year, the past 50 years. Believe it or not, it is Tattered Cover's 50th anniversary, which is a huge feat for a bookstore. But especially over this past year with this pandemic and the health crisis that we've been dealing with across the world, we're just so grateful that you have been able to help us and help us keep our doors open, keep our staff employed. You are amazing, and we cannot thank our community enough. Hopefully very soon we'll be able to gather in a communal space, as Tattered Cover is known for, but right now we're just so grateful for you being a part of our virtual community. So thank you so much for doing that. Before I go any further, I want to let you know that closed captioning is enabled for those who might want it or need it. There's a black bar down at the bottom of the screen with a button labeled CC on it. And once you click that button, closed captioning is enabled should you want it or need it. And I want to let you know a little bit about Tattered Cover Bookstore for those of you who may be joining us nationally and haven't heard of the local independent bookstore in Denver, Colorado. We have 4 locations, soon to be 5, which is amazing. We are opening up our children's exclusive location at Stanley Marketplace, and one of our stores is in the middle of moving. So it's lots of construction, lots of new projects here at Tattered Cover Bookstore. But you can keep up to date with the 3 current open stores and come in and visit us as long as you're wearing your mask over your mouth and your nose. You can come shop and browse for about 90 minutes or so. Trust me, smelling the books is worth it. But also, if you're like me and you want to stay shopping in your pajamas, or you're not from the area, you can come and shop at tatteredcover.com. And also on tatteredcover.com is our events calendar. We have so many events coming up. I literally have one later today, which is our contemporary romance panel. We have ones tomorrow, one called The Holly with reporter Julian Rubenstein. There's amazing events going on, and you should definitely check them out at tatteredcover.com/event. But the event that we have today, I'm very excited to be sharing this with you all. We are celebrating the pre-release, the book will be coming out later, of Stephen Rodgers' new book, A Letter to My White Friends and Colleagues. And just a little bit about our author of the hour here. Stephen Rodgers retired from Harvard Business School in 2019, where he was the MBA class of 1957 senior lecturer in general management. He taught entrepreneurial finance and his own course, Black Business Leaders and Entrepreneurship. Prior to HBS, Professor Rodgers taught at the MBA and PhD programs of the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University, where he received the Outstanding Professor Award for the Executive MBA program 26 times and the Daytime program twice. More recently, Rodgers joins the Steens Family Foundation as an advisor to develop an economic plan for poverty-stricken Black community in Chicago. In 2020, he toured the 10 HBCUs where he taught a workshop titled Entrepreneurial Finance for Black Entrepreneurs. He also served on the board of directors of several corporations, named one of the top 150 influential people by America in Ebony magazine. In America by Ebony magazine. Rodgers is the author of The Entrepreneur's Guide to Finance and Business and multiple Harvard Business School case studies and podcasts focused on Black business and financial issues. And like I said before, we are celebrating his latest book, A Letter to My White Friends and Colleagues. And it is my honor to welcome Stephen Rodgers here. We're going to turn our cameras around so that we can be seen. Hello, sir. We'll unmute you here. Perfect. Hello, how are you?
Good evening, McKaylee. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. It is my absolute pleasure to be here. I want to thank you for taking the time out to host me this evening. I want to thank Tattered Cover for providing this platform to me and this opportunity to me as well. And I want to thank Kwame Spearman, one of the new owners of the bookstore, who I initially reached out to and receptive to having this event with me. And I'm just elated to be here. My book, again, is titled A Letter to My White Friends and Colleagues, What You Can Do Now to Help the Black Community. So good evening, young lady. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. And so I want to start us off by, you mentioned the subtitle, which is great, and I want to get into that more as well. But if you could just start with a summary of the book, and then we have several questions later, and I want to let the audience know that there will be a Q&A afterwards. There's a chat next to the screen that you're watching us on that you can type your questions and comments into. But Stephen, if you don't mind just starting with, what is this book about?
Well, last year on May 25th, 2020, George Floyd was killed. And 6 days after he was killed, my 32-year-old daughter, who worked for a fintech company, she sent me a text message and she said, Dad, the country and specifically the Black community is hurting right now. She said, we need you to act as if you're the president of the country. And we need you to make some statements to the Black community in particular, telling the Black community that it's okay to grieve right now, telling us to take care of ourselves during this pandemic, telling us that it's okay to cry. And so in response to that plea from her, I created a podcast 2 days later titled Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud, and I'm Sad and I'm Angry. And the targeted audience was Black folks. And I said a couple of things there. I reiterated what my daughter had encouraged me to do. And I said, it's okay to grieve and please go through the grieving process. I said that it's okay to continue protesting. Thirdly, I said, please take care of yourself right now. And then finally, I said, this is a time right now to help white people help the Black community if they so have a desire. One of the things I decided, McKaylee, is that I wanted to make sure that Black folks were aware that it was a time to use this potentially as a teachable moment. And I cite in the book the example given when Malcolm X was touring colleges, and Malcolm X, the great civil rights leader, he was touring colleges back in the day. And after one speech, a young white student came up to him and she said to him, Malcolm X, what can I do to help? And his answer to her was nothing. And he went on to say later on, he regretted that answer. And he said he regretted that answer because it was an opportunity that he should have jumped on to have somebody help him help the Black community. And so I created that podcast. Some of my white friends heard the podcast and they immediately said, thank you very much for encouraging Black people to help us help the community. And so with that, I decided to write a book that targeted, instead of the Black audience, that targeted the white audience. And the book's premise and the foundation of the book is that a majority of the problems, Black-white problems that we have in the country, are tied to the wealth gap. They're tied to the fact that on average, white Americans have a net worth of $170,000 compared to $17,000 for Blacks. And I believe that that is the root cause of many of our problems, that the symptoms of our problems are the protesting, the unrest and everything. But the root cause, and I learned this when I worked at Bain & Company consulting firm, never get seduced by the symptoms of a problem. Find the root cause. And I believe these are the root cause. So this is a book that tells the history of how that wealth gap was created. It tells and it's a book that is chock full of data, research, and the focus is on teaching the readers about the history of America, how we got into this situation, and how we can get out of this situation as it relates to whites helping Blacks.
Well, that's wonderful to hear. I thank you so much for that. And I want you, we had mentioned talking about why you wrote this book, but you got into a lot of that. But you did mention the wealth gap, and that being one of the primary primary instigators, the root cause, you say, with this. And so I'm curious if you could explain that more, elaborate more, and talk about maybe what caused the wealth gap between Blacks and whites.
Thank you very much. It is my belief that this wealth gap that I cited earlier, there's a delta, a difference of approximately $153,000 between white and Blacks. And in fact, I'm formerly professor at Harvard Business School. I retired. I've returned back to my home in Chicago now. But in Boston, in Massachusetts, the wealth gap is even worse, where the average net worth of whites in Boston is about $248,000 versus $8 on average for a Black person. And I didn't say 80, I didn't say 800, $8. But the wealth gap that we presently see was, in my opinion, intentional. It was created by the federal government and state governments. Specifically, it came about as a result of three things that the federal and state governments decided to do. And what they decided to do, McKaylee, was enrich whites while at the same time impoverish Blacks. So the discrimination that occurred wasn't simply because they were being mean to Blacks. It was done specifically for the purpose of financial financially rewarding whites while at the same time almost bankrupting blacks. And three things were done by the federal government and state governments to do that. The first thing was slavery. And so in America, slavery began in 1619 under the British, and it ended officially in 1865. So blacks were enslaved in America for 246 years. That clearly was all about enriching whites while at the same time impoverishing blacks. So what you had over that period of time of 246 years, you had 12 generations where no wealth was transferred between black families. Conversely, you had 12 generations where wealth was transferred between white families, generation after generation. And as one scholar said, if you stopped the wealth creation of whites right now, it would take blacks, if they were still accumulating wealth at the rate that they're doing now, it would take blacks over 225 years to catch up. That's not a mystery when you think about the 246 years of slavery. And so what you had was, you had a system that rewarded whites while impoverishing blacks. And the result is where we are today. As one person said, he said, slavery is a perfect example of it's better to have a head start than it is to run fast. Because if you run fast, it's almost impossible to catch up. The second way that the government enriched whites while impoverishing blacks was through this thing called black codes that we explain in the book. And following slavery, Emancipation Proclamation in 1865, state governments decided we can't let this cheap labor get away, specifically black labor. So what they did was, for example, one of the things that I cite in the book is they actually began a propaganda movement telling black people that, when blacks go up north, they end up freezing to death. The other thing they did was they created laws in different states that said that a black person had to have an employment contract on their person at all times. They had to be able to show that they were actually employed by typically their former slave owners. And if they did not have papers that showed that they were employed, they were in violation of vagrancy laws, and they could be jailed for up to a year. And when they were in jail, what happened was the state governments actually they sold the labor from those people to private enterprises, building railroads, building businesses, and it was called convict leasing. So some municipalities, 90% of their annual revenue came in from convict leasing. In essence, enslaving, again, these black people who had gotten out of slavery, and what one author called it was slavery by another name. Now, what they would do also was to get people to stay in the South and to make them in violation of these vagrancy laws, they would go to the train stations, and they being the police and everything, they would go to the train stations, and black people would be at the train stations they would be there waiting to get trains to go north, to go to freedom. They would be arrested at the train stations, and if they were arrested at the train stations for vagrancy laws, they were imprisoned, and then they were made to work for free. And this is a thing that I didn't know about, and I just learned from my research, and that was their children. So the adult men and women were imprisoned. Their children were forced to go work in an indentured status until they were 18 years old if they were male, 21 years old if they were female. So the state governments literally were impoverishing blacks, again, for the purpose of enriching whites. The last thing that I'll point out to you is the fact that the federal government made the decision after the Second World War that they wanted to create a middle class. McKaylee, there was no middle class in America during the Second World War. People were either rich or they were poor. There was no such thing as a 30-year mortgage. Most mortgages were 5 years long. So no one could afford a house except the wealthy. But the American government, the federal government said, we want to change this. We literally want to create a middle class. So what they did was they created the Federal Housing Administration. And under the Federal Housing Administration, they created 30-year mortgages. They literally said to banks, if you give a mortgage to a customer we will guarantee 90% of that mortgage. So the mortgage was now federally guaranteed. As a result of that, banks could lend out money without having the risk of mortgages being defaulted on. The crime there was those mortgages that were being guaranteed by the federal government under the FHA, those mortgages were very explicitly, and it was very explicitly stated by the federal government, that those mortgages were not to be given to Black people. They were not to be given to Negro. These were words actually written. And what the government said was, we're going to identify communities throughout America. We're going to rate the communities A, B, C, or D. An A community theoretically is a community that is safe, low risk. A D community is a high risk community. And a D risk community, for the most part, just meant it had, in their words at that time, Negroes occupying the community, or that the community next to the community that was close to the Black community was also rated a D community. So if a white person wanted to buy a house close to a D community, they would be rejected. But these D communities, there was a red line that the federal government literally drew around these communities. And that's ended up being what's called redlining. So the federal money that was created and put out into the market to subsidize the wealth that the whites got for buying real estate was explicitly denied to Blacks. So it was denied to Blacks via Black banks could not offer mortgages to whites. But at that same time, and people have said, well, there was a time when other immigrants like Italians and Irishmen, they were also discriminated against, but they weren't discriminated against with this FHA loan because they were white skinned. So the Bank of Italy, for example, McKaylee, the Bank of Italy, they flooded the market with mortgages to their Italian citizens. They did a wonderful job. And they gave mortgages to Italians. Italians bought houses. Those same people could not buy houses if they were Black because the federal government would not guarantee those homes. So what you had this massive amount of wealth that ended up being created basically by the federal government, subsidized by the federal government, carried out by the banks, that was only done for whites and not done for whites. It was very, very explicit written documents that said, not only are you a bank, not only are you not allowed to lend to a Black person who lives in one of these communities, they required that the mortgages that people got, the white people got, would have covenants in there that said that house would never be sold to a Black person. So those are the three things that created this wealth gap that has been, in my opinion, the source of over 50% of all the problems that we have in America between Blacks and whites, where you have, for the most part, 35% of the Black community has zero net worth. So the Black community, for the most part, is exactly where the federal and local governments wanted us to be. And the result of that is all of the unrest, the protests we see, because what you know is we're a poverty-stricken community, and poverty-stricken communities tend to be hyper-aggressively policed, okay? And that's what we saw when we saw Eric Gardner killed in New York in 2014, and when we saw George Floyd killed last May 25th over a bad $20 check, and Eric Gardner was because he was selling loose cigarettes. So, but those three incidents right there are the creators of this enormous wealth gap that America has. And I'll close with this. One scholar said that, I've already mentioned that fact, that there is absolutely no way, for the most part, for Black people to ever catch up. We can't outwork ourselves. We can't save enough. We can never catch up with whites. And therefore, one of my recommendations that we'll be talking about later on is reparations. That this financial damage was intentionally done to Blacks. And the only way to get America in a state where it can start healing is something intentionally has to be done to help people that were intentionally impoverished.
Right. And like you said, we're going to get back into that later. And I want to go more into your book and the three, you were great about breaking it down into threes, and you have three big recommendations that you talk about in the book. And I want to go through each of them one at a time here. But the first one is depositing money in Black banks. What about that specifically is helpful, and why is that in your book as a recommendation?
It's a recommendation because one is it's really easy. if you're white and you want to be a part of the solution to the problem, that's an easy thing to do. And what I recommend is that people, that they deposit at least 9.29% of their annual savings in a Black-owned bank. And the 9.29% represents the 9 minutes and 29 seconds that Officer Chauvin had his knee on George Floyd's neck. So it's symbolic in that sense. So I recommend at least 9.29%. First of all, what we know is that Black banks were created immediately after the Emancipation Proclamation. And the first Black bank that was created was called the Freedmen's Bank. And that was created by the federal government for the purpose of providing a place where the new freedmen can save their money. Black banks were also, and they grew primarily because white banks would not loan money to Black people. And so everything that we're going to be talking about was created for the most part because of anti-Black discrimination. So white-owned banks would take deposits, but they would not loan money to Black people. You know, in the book, we talk about the fact that prior to 1960, Harlem, New York, didn't have any Black-owned banks, didn't have any banks other than they had branches of white banks, and the white banks would take deposits from their branches and then funnel the money and send it back up to Midtown, where they would loan money to white businessmen, but they would not loan money to Black business people. So Black-owned banks have been, just like all banks, they've been the vehicle by which money and resources get to the Black community. What we know today, for example, is the fact that 70% of mortgages given by Black-owned banks go to Black people, whereas white-owned banks, less than 1% of mortgages go to Black people. And we know the key to any kind of wealth generation is owning real estate. And there's only 21 Black-owned banks. And the reason why they're so small is because Black-owned banks have been expected to do a Herculean job because they, for the most part, have gotten deposits primarily from poor Black people because Black people are impoverished. And so the problem with that is when you get money from people who are impoverished, you get small amount of money that gets deposited and the money gets taken out very rapidly. So the expenses for that bank actually goes up. But more importantly, what happens, McKaylee, is that banks in those instances do not get the benefit of what's called the money multiplier. And the money multiplier works something like this. You put $100 in a bank, and then the bank I go to buy a house, and the bank gives me 90 of that $100, and they put $10 in what's called fractional lending. They hold $10. They loan me $90 to buy the house. I take the $90. I buy a house from somebody else. That other person that I buy the house from, they take the $90 I've given them, and they put it in their bank. So what we see there in that instance is that $100 that you gave now is $190 in two separate banks. Okay, we've just actually created money, and that's what banks do. But the money has to go in and has to stay there. Therefore, we need money to go to the Black banks, so that money can be used by Black banks to lend to Black businesses, for example, to issue mortgages to Black people as well. 80% of commercial loans by Black-owned banks go to Black business people. And I'll close with this, and that is, I'll close with two last points, and that is one, Black-owned banks have been denied, as I stated earlier, the opportunity to provide mortgages up until 1968 when it became illegal for the redlining. But Black-owned banks were denied the opportunity to provide mortgages. And the mortgage business is one of the most profitable businesses that banks are in. And as a result of Black-owned banks not being able to provide mortgages to the Black community, those Black-owned banks were not making profits. Therefore, they could not lend money to Black businesses or anything. So we see this, how it impacts a whole community in that instance right there. Again, let me go back to the example of Bank of Italy. And the Bank of Italy ended up being so doggone prosperous because they were able to participate in FHA lending that the Bank of Italy today, Michaela, the Bank of Italy today is the Bank of America. Okay, so Black-owned banks, and what I'm recommending, therefore, is I'm recommending those in the audience and those readers, I'm recommending that they deposit money in a Black-owned bank. And it's risk-free because the federal government will guarantee deposits of up to $250,000. So I'm recommending that people put money in a Black-owned bank and that they leave it there for 3 to 5 years. And every year I'm asking people to put more money in a Black-owned bank that's part of their savings. It's risk-free and it's easy peasy as a result of that.
Well, then that transitions into, just as we're continuing to talk about money, into your second point, which is donating to historically Black colleges and universities, also known as HBCUs. And I know you have a specific story about Lincoln University that you want to share as well. So can you talk about that?
Yes, I will. Thank you. First of all, historically Black colleges and universities, again, they were created. The earliest one was in 1937, and it was created at that time for free Black people. Then after Emancipation Proclamation, that's when an explosion of historically Black colleges and universities were created. And then they were created because Blacks were not permitted to matriculate at white schools. So these universities were created, many of which were created actually by whites. So you see a university like Spelman College, an all-women's college in Atlanta, very famous school. Well, one of the Rockefellers were instrumental in helping to create that. You look at another university, Morehouse College. Many of the schools were created by white religious organizations. Morehouse is named after the secretary of a religious organization that created Morehouse College. Howard University in Washington, D.C., where Vice President Kamala went. Howard University is named after Howard Sherman, the general who actually was part of the first effort by America to give reparations. So most HBCUs actually were created by whites, and I'm asking whites again to step up to be a part of it. Today, we have about 101 HBCUs. I went on a tour after I retired from Harvard Business School in 2019. I went on a tour, as you mentioned in my introduction, to 12 HBCUs because I wanted to teach Black people the same stuff that I was teaching very wealthy white people at Harvard Business School. And they were not being taught that because of their resources. There are approximately 300,000 students at HBCUs. And the schools, HBCUs, their history goes, Dr. King attended an HBCU. He attended Morehouse. Thurgood Marshall, Supreme Court Justice, attended Lincoln University. Rosalind Brewer, today's CEO of Walgreens, she attended Spelman College. And as I mentioned, Vice President Kamala Harris attended an HBCU. But the importance of HBCUs today can be reflected by some other statistics I'm about to give you. And that is, today, 80% of all Black judges in America attended an HBCU. Today, 50% of all Black attorneys attended an HBCU. 50% of all Black doctors attended an HBCU. 40% of all Black engineers attended an HBCU. And 40% of the Black members of the Congress attended an HBCU. So we see the impact of HBCUs today. There's only 101 of them, okay? But their impact is phenomenal. And the challenge that HBCUs have, and I've always said that HBCUs should be given MacArthur grants, genius grants, because they've been able to spend sort of straw into gold in the form of staying alive. The average endowment of an HBCU is only $12 million. Most HBCUs, because they are catering to impoverished people, they're not lucky to be endowed with major donations by major donors and everything like that. 70% of the students who attend an HBCU receive Pell Grants. Those are federal government grants. And to qualify for such a grant, you have to come from a household that has income of $26,000, annual income of $26,000 or less. The American poverty level is $21,000. So it's just $5,000 above. But over 70% of students at HBCUs qualify for Pell Grants, whereas on a national level, 39% of students qualify for Pell Grants. We also see that at HBCUs, over 60% of the students at HBCUs are first-generation students. Neither their father nor their mother attended college. Whereas, again, what we see in terms of the white student population, in terms of colleges. It's about 30% that are first generation. The Ivy Leagues, where I matriculated, graduate school, is obviously the worst. Just 15% of them are first generation. So the HBCUs are doing work with students that almost nobody else wants because they're impoverished students. And if there was no HBCUs today, I believe that over 50% of those students who are there probably would not be in college today. So I'm asking the readers, I'm asking the listeners to emulate the young lady, Mackenzie Scott, who is part of the founding of Amazon. And Mackenzie Scott last year, she donated $560 million to HBCUs. She's a white woman, and she decided, I want to be part of the solution to the problem. And she sent these checks to the presidents of these schools. They didn't apply for money. She sent the checks to them, and this is what she said. You know what you're doing, use the money however you want to. And so she's provided opportunities for more Black students to be educated and provide education, get provided education. And that's why I'm asking others to do the same.
Well, I'm glad that Amazon's doing one good thing, or somebody from there.
Well, let me just say this, but she got rid of the guy who, she got divorced from Jeff Bezos. Primarily, one of the reasons why she got divorced from him, because she felt that he was unwilling to be magnanimous, that she did immediately after. Very quickly, let me tell you the story about Lincoln University. First of all, there are two Lincoln universities in the HBCU spectrum. One is in Missouri, and it was founded in 1865, and it was founded by former veterans of the Union Army, Black veterans of the Union Army. They actually pooled their money together to create the school. It's a school about 2,000 students, just a beautiful little campus. The most amazing thing about it today is, now it's a public school, but the most amazing thing about it today is over 70% of the students are white. So it's no longer dominated by Black students, but it's still technically an HBCU. But it's a beautiful school. It was one of the schools that I visited. But that's a story that's a little different from another school by the name of Lincoln University that was also created the same year. But Lincoln University, outside of Philadelphia, in the suburbs of Philadelphia, was created by the Quaker community, again, a white community. And they created Lincoln University in 1865 for freedmen, newly freedmen. And Lincoln University, outside of Philadelphia, about 30 miles outside of Philadelphia, is a beautiful little small school. Thurgood Marshall attended school there. Langston Hughes, the great Black poet, attended Lincoln University as well. And when I did my research prior to doing my tour of HBCUs, I took note of the fact that this school, Lincoln University, had an endowment of almost $40 million. And I said, man, the average endowment is $12 million. This little school has such a huge endowment. Why? So this is what I found out. Lincoln University, the first Black president of Lincoln University was a man by the name of Horace Bond. He was Julian Bond's father. Julian Bond, the great civil rights leader. And Horace Bond befriended a white guy by the name of Albert Barnes. And Albert Barnes was this sort of eccentric guy. He was white, but he was an eccentric, brilliant man who actually created the stuff that they put in, the chemicals they put in a baby's eye when they come out of the birth canal so that they don't catch venereal disease. You're not familiar with that? No, they put that. So Albert Barnes created that chemical, and he created a company that sold that chemical. And he became extraordinarily wealthy. And with that wealth, he began buying art. So he buys all of this art. And at the same time, he's friends with Horace Bond. And Horace Bond invited him to teach at Lincoln University. And you would have thought, when you read all the information, that Albert Barnes was being offered a chance to teach at the best school ever in the world. He was just so appreciative of it. But this was an enormously wealthy man who was being provided this opportunity. And he began buying art. So he buys this art, and then he decides to actually exhibit the art. So he exhibits the art and shows it. And the white elite in the art industry of the city of Philadelphia, they bash the art. They say the art is trash. They say that the display of the art is even worse. And so Albert Barnes, after getting that thrashing, and it was in the newspaper and everything, he swore never to let the white elite look at his art and never to have it displayed anywhere other than in the suburb of Philadelphia. Albert Barnes ended up in a car crash, dies in 1951. His wife takes over the estate. They don't have any children. His wife dies in like 1989. At her death, the will is read. And the will says that their art collection is to be managed, not owned, but managed by this little university that no one has ever heard of called Lincoln University. And everybody's just amazed because they say, wait, this little university no one has ever heard of with only 1,300 students, this university, this HBCU is now managing. Albert Barnes set it up such that there was a board of directors. 4 members of the board of directors were to be selected by Lincoln University. So there was only to be 5 board members. The value of the art was $25 billion. Okay? There were 4,000 pieces of art, 181 works by Renoir, 69 by Paul Cézanne, 59 Matisse, and 46 Picassos. So this little bitty school, Lincoln University, an HBCU, 1,300 students, that is actually in trouble financially, is now the manager of this art. And the art elite of Philadelphia, they were furious. And they said, wait, this art collection is so doggone prominent that if we had this art and could display it in a museum downtown, we could be the art epicenter of the world. So they said, we want that art. But remember, Albert Barnes said, never was the art to be moved. So he gave that mandate in his will. He gave $10 million for the management of the art. But the problem was the wealthy white elite of Philadelphia wanted that art. And the governor of Philadelphia actually got involved. And they went and they told Lincoln University, if you don't give us the art, then we're going to come after you. And what they ended up saying was, if you give us the art, we'll agree, and we want you to agree to increase the board of directors from 5 people to 15. And if they increase to 15, then they could put as many people on the board that were non-Lincoln University as they wanted to. Lincoln University only had $10 million. This story is taught at law schools throughout the country, because this is a case that is a movie called The Art of the Steal. And it's a case about a will being broken. Albert Barnes had a will that said this art was never to be moved from this suburban location outside of Philadelphia. And they ended up moving it and taking the collection over, built this beautiful museum that houses the art today. And in return, as you look at all of the laws that were passed and the budget that was passed, you saw a line item for $125 million that went to Lincoln University. That's why when I visited Lincoln University, one of the most beautiful little campuses in the country. New buildings, new STEM building and everything, but all of it came about as a result of that. I believe that Lincoln University did the right thing. They did not have the means to fight to keep the art collection. Be mindful, they were only the managers of it. So they didn't have any means to fight. Albert Barnes did not leave enough money to fight the government and everything. So they worked out the best deal possible. But that's a story that is highlighted in the book when we talk about HBCUs that I wanted to share with the audience.
Wow. I have a movie to go watch now.
There you go.
So we only have 20 minutes left here, but I want to make sure we leave some room for audience questions too. So the third point that you bring up here is spending money with Black-owned businesses. And so if you elaborate a little bit more on that.
Very quickly, let me just say this. Again, my ask in the book is that people donate, the readers and the viewers, that they donate at least 9.29% of their money to HBCUs every year. Everything I've recommended, I've done. My donations have gone to Fisk University down in Nashville, Tennessee, as well as a small college in North Carolina called Bennett College, which is an all-women's college. and it has one of the best models I've ever seen in my life. When I went down there to teach, the motto is Bennett College, where the girl that you are comes to meet the woman that you're going to be. So those are the two universities that have received my philanthropic dollars. And I'm asking others in terms of Black businesses to support Black businesses. Probably 40% of my annual budget is spent with Black businesses throughout the Chicagoland area and the country. And I'm asking people to emulate that and spend at least 9.29% of their annual budget with Black-owned businesses, because Black-owned businesses create jobs for Black people. What we know from empirical research is the largest private employer of Black people in the country are Black-owned businesses. The largest employer of Black people is the government, but the largest private employer are Black-owned businesses. And what we know from research, and it was done by a scholar by the name of Dr. Timothy Bates with a book called Banking on Black Enterprise, and he's a white scholar. But what we know from his research is that Black-owned businesses, be they located in the inner city, be they located in the suburbs, be they located in the rural area, they will hire Black people. What we know conversely is white-owned businesses, even white-owned businesses located in Black communities, will not necessarily hire Black people. So that's an absolute fact. Therefore, if Black people are to be employed, then what we know is we need to feed Black-owned businesses and help them grow so that they can create more jobs for that purpose. And that's why I'm asking people to support Black-owned businesses, as well as the fact that Black-owned businesses have historically been contributors to quality of life in America. Black-owned businesses created, the stoplight. A Black-owned business created the elevator. So I'm asking people to make a commitment to do business with Black-owned businesses. And in the book, I actually give you the way to find Black-owned businesses. I give you keyword searches that you can use, as well as organizations that you can contact to do that. Very quickly, I do business with a Black female law firm, a Black female accounting firm. I do business with a Black bank. My caterer is a Black-owned business. Black restaurants, I love Black restaurants, and the section of the book about Black-owned businesses is devoted to the beauty of Black restaurants and their importance to the Black community. So that's one of the other recommendations that I gave in the book as well. And I try to make it easy for the readers to do that by arming them with information on how to find Black-owned businesses in their communities.
No, and that's great. It's a part of your letter to white friends and colleagues is giving those resources. So you really break it down very nicely. And so then before we move to any audience Q&A that we have here, I know you want to close out on your making your case for reparations and a way for the Black community to catch up, as you mentioned earlier. So why don't you go ahead and end on that for us before we move to Q&A?
Okay, very good. As I stated earlier, there's no way for Black people to catch up wealth-wise with the white community unless something is intentionally done that is dramatically different from just expecting Black people to work harder, Black people to make more savings. We're not behind because we didn't work hard. Black people worked as hard as anybody, and we just can't catch up simply because of that head start that came from those three things that I mentioned earlier. And following slavery, America never did anything to help Black people. There was never any effort to provide reparations. There was one effort to provide some sense of reparations, and that was in what's called the Field Order number 15, where following Emancipation Proclamation, President Lincoln said what we're going to do, and he did this in response to General Howard Sherman. General Howard Sherman was going through Savannah as he was beating the Confederates. And as he was marching through Savannah with victory and defeating the Confederates, the enslaved Black people would leave the plantations and start following the Union soldiers. And General Sherman sent a letter to President Lincoln, and he said, all of these Negroes are following us. And President Lincoln, and I'm using the words that were in the letter, President Lincoln said, ask the Negroes, what do they want? And so General Sherman met with 20 religious leaders of the Black community. These 20 men, it was all men, these 20 men, they met with General Sherman in a hotel in Savannah. And he asked them, he says, what do you guys want? And they said, we want land. We want land so that we can take care of ourselves. Then he asked, he said, do you want land amongst the white community or do you want it separately? It wasn't unanimous, but it was a majority who said, we want it separately because we don't trust that whites will treat us fairly. And so following that, General Sherman implemented Special Order number 15, where the act was that they were going to take 400,000 acres from the Confederates, and they were going to try the Confederates for treason. Some of the Confederates were actually going to be hanged, and they were going to be tried for treason, and they were taking their land from them, and they were going to give it to the new freedmen in plots of 40 acres each for each family. 40 acres for each family at $1.25 per acre, 40% down payment, okay? And so 40,000 acres were actually given to the new freedmen. And then Lincoln gets killed. Lincoln gets killed, and when he gets killed, he is succeeded by his vice president, Andrew Johnson, who is a Southerner, and the first thing he says is, nope. He said this, it states in the book, he said, the Negro should work for what they get. That it's unfair to give them land, it's unfair to whites to give them land, and therefore he rescinded all of the policies, Special Order number 15. He had the 40,000 acres returned to the white Confederates, former Confederates. He pardoned all of the white former Confederates as well, and all of the land was taken. So America has never given Black people any kind of reparations, but there's precedent for it in this country. We know that there's precedent internationally with the Germans giving Jews reparations to the tune of almost $90 billion for the disastrous thing they did to Jews during the Second World War. But America has never done anything for Blacks, but it has done for others. Specifically, for example, America gave reparations to the Japanese Americans. In the Second World War, America decided, unfortunately, using racial discrimination, to imprison 120,000 Japanese Americans. And they did it because they said they were concerned that Japanese Americans would not be loyal to the country, because Second World War was against Japan, but it was also against Italy and Germany. But they did not imprison people of German descent or people of Italian descent. They did it to the Japanese Americans. So they imprisoned them for 3 years. And in 1988, President Reagan apologized to Japanese Americans, and he signed a bill giving Japanese Americans, 80,000 of them, a check for $20,000 each. So that was reparations for that. The only group that's ever gotten any reparations from slavery were former slave owners. After Emancipation Proclamation, 979 slave owners received from the federal government $300 for every enslaved person that they held. So never has a dollar been given to the Black community for the enslavement of Black people. And it's about time for America to step up and right that wrong. And I believe that's where the healing begins. And so I'm a strong proponent of the recommendation that I'm asking the readers to send a letter to the congressman. We give you a template in the book of the kind of letter that we've actually asked you to write, but ask the Congress to pass H.R. 40. H.R. 40 is the bill for reparations to be studied for Black Americans, and it stands for the 40 acres I mentioned. But I'm asking people to send a letter to Congress asking the federal government to provide reparations to the Black community, Black folks who are descendants of Black people. And this is the program that I'm proposing, that the reparations should go to Blacks who are descendants of formerly enslaved people. I believe there's about 20 million Black people who fall into that category who are 18 years or older. And I believe that, and I'm recommending that one check to the tune of $153,000, which is the difference between white wealth and Black wealth, $170,000 and $17,000, that one check be sent to Black people 18 and older who are descendants of African-American slaves as part of an effort to begin the true healing of America and to bring Black Americans at the same level economically as white Americans, and that the money be taken from the Federal Reserve, just like the money was taken from the Federal Reserve for PPP funding, for the money that the federal government just gave people during this pandemic. And if 153,000 is given to 20 million people, the cost would be $3 trillion. The federal government spent $4 trillion to bail out banks. So this is affordable, but it would be $3 trillion that's given to the Black community. And that would bring, for the most part, Blacks and whites equal financially. And you would see a huge change in the quality of life of Black people in America, but you'd also see a complete renewal and a new America that has been trying to find a way to right wrongs, but we need to do something as aggressively as reparations, in my opinion, to address this problem. So that's my case for reparations. I'll close with this statement. There has never been another race or ethnic group in America that has been more loyal to America. Black Americans, unlike any other ethnic group or race, there's no other group that has fought in more wars than Black Americans have fought in for America.
Sorry, I was trying to unmute myself there. Here we go. So I want to turn it over to audience Q&A. Thank you for your variety of perspectives. Thank you for the book, and thank you for laying it out. You know what I mean? That's not something that everybody wants to do or feels that they can. So it takes tremendous courage and empathy to be able to step up in that way. But that leads into one of the questions here in the audience is that, what do you say to those who criticize whites for asking for help from the Black community when they can just do the research on their own?
Oh, I love that question. I mentioned at the beginning that I in my podcast, I said to to the Black audience, many of you are probably annoyed, upset with whites. I said, but this is not the time now to angrily tell them in response to their question, what can I do to help? This is not the time to say nothing. This is not the time to say, get out of my face. I don't know the answer. You know the answer. You are part of the problem. So what I say to them is, the question is, go to my book, because that book is an attempt by a Black person to actually help a white person help the Black community. And the book also, while it says a letter to my white friends, the book also is targeting Black people as well, because I want them, and I want them to do exactly what I'm asking whites to do if they have the resources. But also, I want to arm them with the ability to help and teach whites why this should be done. I'll close this out in terms of that question. When George Floyd was murdered, immediately after that, I served on the board of several board of directors of corporations. I gave speeches to my board of directors, and the title of the speeches, which was a precursor to the book, was, how did we get into this mess and what can we do? And what I sought to do with that was, and the audience in those instances were all whites for the most part, but the purpose of that speech was to educate whites around what happened, because most whites are not aware of what's happened. They're not aware. I did this with my alma mater last week, a talk with Williams College, and one of my classmates sent me an email afterwards saying, I knew about redlining, but I thought it was the banks. I never knew it was the federal government. And so what you have is, you have people who don't know, and I just believe it's a teachable moment. And if we can help people who are interested in doing the right thing and helping, then that is the cross that we bear, if you will, for those who find it as being burdensome. I don't find it as being burdensome. And I'm hopeful that I'm arming people with a response with my book.
I honestly don't think there's a better place to end in terms of how your book, what you hope people get out of it, something that you're very, very passionate about and able to talk so eloquently about it. It's really wonderful to see you stepping up and sharing that, because you could just keep it to yourself. But you didn't. No, it's true, but you didn't. You wrote this book, you took the time, which is never an easy thing to do. I've interviewed countless authors. Writing a book is not easy. And so there's many people that are going to be grateful for A Letter to My White Friends and Colleagues when it comes out. And you can get your copies at tatteredcover.com or at any of our stores when it comes out later this month. Stephen, I want to give you the opportunity to remind people who you are, where they can find you online, and anything else that you want to say before we close out this evening.
Well, first of all, let me say, again, thank you very much to you. You've done a wonderful job as a hostess. Thank you for Tattered Cover as well. I'd like to close by saying what I mentioned to you earlier, and that is, while I'm not able to sign and autograph books, I am able to have and will send to Tattered Cover autograph plates that can be put into books. So we'll do that. Secondly, I would say that, and I would like to close with the fact that there is an opportunity for the listeners to be a part of the solution to the problem. And I've given you some action steps that you can take, as well as I've given the reasons behind it. I think you will actually just absolutely love reading what I've shared with you. As I stated to you before, it is not just sort of free-flowing thought, but it is highly researched with great data. You can find out and go to my website, and it's Stephen S. Rodgers. Stephen, STEVENSROGERS, StephenSRogers.com. And that's my website. And you can see much more about me and read more about me there, as well as listen to some podcasts that I've done. But again, this has been my absolute pleasure, my joy. Thank you very much.
It's my pleasure as well. And once again, I'm McKaylee with Tattered Cover Bookstore here with Stephen Rodgers, celebrating his book, which comes out later in May, A Letter to My White Friends and Colleagues. It's something that you can get at tatteredcover.com, where you can get signed book plates by Stephen, which I'll ask you to hang out here while I just close this out. Thank you all again. For some of you, it's dinner time out there. We really recommend that you support local businesses, support local Black businesses. We wouldn't be here without you, especially during this time. And so we ask you all to stay safe and happy reading. Thanks, everybody. And we're out.
We're out. Thank you very much. You're outstanding.